Welcome to everybody who's joining us from all over the world, I hope, to this conversation that we have organized at Basque Culinary Center with one of the top fermentists right now. It is a great pleasure for us to have you with us because we want to dive today into a world that's alive, literally. Fermentation is one of humanity's oldest technique, and yet somehow right now it feels more relevant, urgent, and more inspiring than ever. Fermentation is bubbling up everywhere. We find it as an important topic in research R&D labs all over the world, in tasting menus literally everywhere. Is an important part of the sustainability debate nowadays, and of course is in home kitchens as well. So what's going on? To answer this question, we have been lucky enough to have people like Sandor Katz, for example, here today. Hello, Sandor, how are you?
Happy to
Welcome.
be here.
And thank you for making of fermentation a verb that has been contagious in time. His books, like Wild Fermentation or The Art of Fermentation, literally amazing Bibles for everybody who starts fermenting by themselves, have changed, I would say, everything. Your books settle like an important mark for everybody. We also have Arielle Johnson. Hello, Arielle, how are you?
Hi, great. Thanks. Nice to see you guys.
Arielle is a flavor scientist who has been turning complex chemistry into creative tools for people working in gastronomy. And we have also Johnny Drain. Thank you, Johnny. He's a scientist that has become a fermentation innovator who founded a company producing cacao-free chocolate using fermentation, but also it's one of the co-creators of Mold Magazine, and he just launched a new book, Adventures in Fermentation. We have Diego Prado, a chef researcher with years in experience in the R&D field, who has a very strange power, a power to bring these people together as he did for us today. And we also have Cipriano Carrero, who is a scientist, PhD in applied chemistry, professor at Basque Culinary Center, and also in charge of a new adventure for the BCC, which is a master focus in food fermentation. So how about we get started and we ferment this dialogue together? So I want to begin with the luck of having Sander with us today to ask him if when he was first fermenting sauerkraut in his Tennessee, if he imagined that all this would happen.
Well, I mean, of course not. But what I will say is that, as my own personal obsession with fermentation grew, let's say in the 90s, leading up to Wild Fermentation, which I wrote in 2001 and was published in 2003. As I was developing this obsession and making all of these foods and sharing all of these foods and my excitement about fermentation with whoever would listen to me, I realized I was not alone in this interest. It was very much, it was very abundantly clear to me from the very beginning that fermentation was meaningful to many people for many different reasons. And I kept meeting people who said like, oh, right, my grandparents used to do some kind of, fermentation routine every year. And then my mother's generation dropped it, but I wonder what they were doing. Or, in the land that I came from, flavors of fermentation were so much more prominent in the cuisine than in, this new land that I've moved to. Or people with health issues who had been exploring, alternative ideas about healing and realized that, oh, maybe the bacteria in my gut have something to do with the issues that I'm having, and I need to seek out these foods. So it was clear to me from the very beginning that I was not alone in my interest in fermentation, and that many different people coming at it from many different perspectives, shared my interest. And, the reality is that every person everywhere eats and drinks things that are fermented all the time, and it's so integral to the culinary landscape everywhere.
But what was missing for this to happen just recently? That all
Well,
this curiosity and eagerness around
well,
fermentation
I
just
mean,
came together in this phenomena, no?
Well, I will just say that the products of fermentation have always been prominent. It's just that, over the course of the 20th century and probably going back further than that, fewer people were involved in how the raw products of nature and agriculture turn into the foods and beverages that we eat. And as, production scaled up and became more centralized, production of food, period, including fermentation. And so, the products of fermentation continued to be prominent: bread, cheese, cured meats, vinegar, beer, wine. Like, I mean, these just have been part of the culinary landscape for everybody. It's just that food production disappeared from, households and communities and became increasingly centralized. And the big thing that happened around the dawn of the new millennium is the Human Microbiome Project. So, after a century of people imagining bacteria as something dangerous, which need to be avoided and need to be handled by specialists if they're going to be used at all, people started recognizing that bacteria are not our enemies. Bacteria are, an important part of how we function. And more people became interested in bacteria and biodiversity as it manifests in our bodies. And I really think that that is the big thing that changed, and that that's what made more and more people get interested in fermentation. That's what
Yeah.
made chefs around the world start thinking more about fermentation. But I think that that's the big thing that changed.
And also in some contests, let's say maybe people got to believe that they could make bread, for example, for themselves, which is something very important that brings fermentation, no? Like
Yeah.
brings the power back to peoples in
Well,
order for
sure,
them to
but
believe that they can cook their food.
what we have to recognize is that that never disappeared. It might have become more limited. It might have become more rare or obscure, but there have always been people who were making their own sourdough bread. Like, there's a lot of continuity in all of these things. So, here I have a jar of pickles that I made out of cucumbers from my garden last week. It's still fermenting, but there just have always been people carrying on these processes. That there have always been people with gardens. I mean, it might be rare, but there are people with gardens. And if you have a garden, there are moments of the season when you have a crazy overabundance, and fermentation is just part of how people have dealt with that. There always have been people with small herds of goats and sheep who have been making a cheese on a small scale. There have always been people making bread for their families using a sourdough passed down through the generations. So even when these things have not been common, they've never disappeared. There have
Yeah.
always been, there have always been people carrying on the traditions, and that's why it's possible to like learn about these processes, because they never disappeared and became 100% industrialized.
Yeah. So for you, I get this is not a simple fashionable moment. Instead, it's a
Well,
depth,
I
deep
mean, I would say beginning
phenomenon.
around 2010, I started seeing on these lists of like, the 10 hot new food trends of 2010, fermentation. So sure, there's no denying that, like, going back at least that far, there's been a growing interest in fermentation. That's a wonderful thing. But fermentation was not a hot new trend in food in 2010. It's not a hot new trend in food in 2025. It wasn't a hot new trend in food in, 1859. It wasn't a hot new trend in 1500. It has just been, it's an inevitable part of how food is transformed. And, cultural traditions in every part of the world made observations hundreds and thousands of years ago that enabled them to work with this invisible life force that's on food. And that's why it's found everywhere. And, there's nothing new about it. Sure, there's a lot of exciting new cross-cultural pollination, high-tech experimentation. Certainly, microbiology has enabled us to understand a lot more what's going on, but none of the major fermentation processes that we use were designed according to scientific principles. Basically, microbiology has developed its principles by observing how people have applied fermentation in different contexts. And that's very illuminating. It's very interesting, and it's enabling us to try a lot of new things. I don't want to minimize the importance of this, but you do not need to be a microbiologist or in a laboratory to practice fermentation. Here I am in my busy kitchen, and I have all kinds of fermentation. Actually, I have koji in my incubator right now. But fermentation is absolutely possible for anyone to do in the most basic home kitchen.
Well,
So when
sorry, if
something
I
like
can
this,
jump, can I?
yes, of
Sorry.
course, of course.
Oh, Sandor, it's interesting that you bring up the date 2010 because, that was obviously like 2 years after the 2008 financial crisis. I graduated college in 2009, and I know among me and my friends, we were all so broke in 2010 that a hobby where we could do something cheaply that made things that were delicious, whether that was home brewing or sauerkraut, was so exciting. And yeah, I mean, to give the perspective of somebody who hasn't had the depth of experience that you have, that was definitely a precipitating factor, I think, at least for some of us.
So
Well,
you
and
think
also in the
when something like
pandemic,
this,
also in the pandemic, I mean, then that was a time when a lot of people had a lot of time. And so, we saw another sort of, surge of interest in fermentation. But there's also continuity and the major things. So if a lot of people in 2020 started making sourdough bread at home for the first time, that's beautiful. But sourdough bread has been around for 10,000 years. Until 150 years ago, all bread was more or less what we would call sourdough bread today because there was no pure yeast to work with. And there's nothing new about bread. It might be new in someone's life. I mean, it can be a whole new chapter in someone's life when they start making bread. It can be transformative, but you can't say that bread is new.
of course. How about Diego? Now that we have you as a chef here, how about the way this is being used in fine dining, for example, no?
I think, I mean, something crucial that I guess it's the same what Sandor said, that also mm, it's easier to use or to understand in the sense that fermentation has always been there. Everyone knows about bread and wine and cheese, etc. But now, I guess the big difference in in restaurants and also science and fine dining is we're really understanding why this happened and how this is happening, and that we are very much closer to the say a scientific methodology and all that, and we get all of this information that we didn't had before. No, everything before was a little bit more empirical, a try and error, try a little bit of this, try a little bit of that, especially with sourdough cheeses or wine, no. But now we really are understanding that they're really using these microorganisms that are very, I would say, more common, and nobody gets surprised if someone is using koji or doing their own sauces or their own misos, like something completely normal. It's like saying that you in a fine dining you do your own bread. Of course, you also do your own fermented sauces or your misos or whatever it is. No, so I guess it's definitely getting way more normalized, no? And what is the focus now is definitely now maybe trying to find new microorganisms that we haven't explored yet, and trying to put that into use into fine dining to do a little bit more, I I would say, innovation kind of approach, no?
But it goes beyond fine dining, luckily. But it's interesting if we see that creative restaurants are focusing on fermentation, and there must be a reason for it. We find more easily fermentation stations as something normal, no, in the kitchens. And it makes me wonder, no, if in the same way that maybe we had El Bulli showing and spreading a message full of spherifications and foams, if now the myceliums or like all the language that comes with the fermentation molds, we are seeing them everywhere, no, as an
Yeah.
expression of creative cooking. Do you think it might become like an old fashioned in time, as it also happened with this static that brought and the mindset that brought El Bulli?
I mean, I mean, yes and no at the same time. Yes, also because of it has always been there, no? So it's already like something old, no? But the main difference is the understanding we have, but it definitely will become like a, I mean, say, I guess like normalized. Like I just said, like people using koji or using like whatever. Like now we are working a lot like with neurospore intermedia that is still like new. But of course, it will be normal in a few years. Like everyone will start using it, and it will become a normal and normal. Don't think it is old fashioned because I guess fermentation is old fashioned by definition in that sense, no?
But is there a frontier? I mean, you can try to, I don't know, inoculate penicillium to anything to just to show off how original or peculiar you might get in your cuisine.
I mean, yes, but it's like everything, no? You can use to make good use or bad use of anything, like any technique or any flashy things, depending of the reasons you're doing it. But definitely, I mean, there's very good examples there. Of course, after Noma and like restaurant like Noma and Mugaritz, I mean, they definitely, in my opinion, they have been leading the restaurant scene in the fermentation world, no? So everyone is a little bit following them, no?
Arielle, you have worked in some of the most influential restaurants in the world, including Noma, helping rethink how flavor can be created. What makes fermentation such a powerful tool for designing flavor?
Well, I mean, like, I guess speaking from like a very, very technical level, uh, fermentation is all about creating new flavors on a molecular level. The like biochemical processes that a lactic acid bacteria or a yeast uses to, consume its food and, multiply and live. Small byproducts of those things are, turns out, very tasty flavor molecules. But from a more like creative standpoint, I think like even even if you get like quite technical with fermentation, it's a transformation that's only like partly predictable. Just because there's, especially if you're using like a mixed culture or wild fermentation, there's so many interactions and emergent properties that you can't actually know how something is going to turn out. And even if you try to do the same thing twice, something about the temperature and the humidity in the room, or slightly different sourcing on the ingredients can put things on these sort of like chaotic in a technical sense ways. So I think that means it never gets boring, and I think that keeps people coming back to it. I think, sorry, this is not what you asked, but I think the LBU thing that we were talking about just a second ago is like more pertinent, maybe even than most people think. I mean, like, again, in this kind of like late aughts, early 2010s era, what you had was a lot of chefs who had like worked and trained at places like LBE, the Fat Duck, WD-50, where this kind of like deliberate experimentation and investigation was like normalized. So I think really as a natural consequence of that, people who had learned that is how you cook and have a creative restaurant, of course, would then go on to apply that in some other avenue of investigation, even if fermentation doesn't look like spherification. I think it's very much in the same creative tradition that way.
About the food industry taking advantage of this path that comes up with fermentation. For you, Arielle.
Oh, I mean, I've worked both, kind of on like the very, very industrial side, consulting, and like much more artisanal. To me, I think the most interesting space is like people who are, you know, adapting and adopting technical knowledge, but using it for more like um, localized, biodiverse specialty projects. So it's I guess what's interesting to me is this kind of intersection of uh like knowledge of very technical things, but with a much more kind of cultural even say like traditional cuisine kind of mindset about values and place.
It's good to bring Johnny into this conversation, into this topic specifically. Your work in win-win, is it the way to pronounce it? Win-win shows fermentation's ability to go beyond preservation of or taste. It can rethink supply chains. You're essentially building chocolate from the molecule up. What's the potential of fermentation in this field? Can it really be a solution when projecting a sustainable future? A small question, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is an unequivocal yes, to touch on things that some of the others have already mentioned. But fermentation gives you access to all of these flavor compounds via different routes. With win-win, the concept was, can you make something that tastes like chocolate, that has the same suite of flavor compounds? Sorry, same suite of flavor compounds that characterize chocolate, but can you get them from something that's not a cocoa bean? Could you do the same for coffee? And there's a philosophical exercise like, can you do it? Which is interesting, but also when you dig deeper into some of those commodity products, they often have a dark side: child labor, slave labor, mass deforestation, and with climate change, sort of scarcity of some of these products that we know and love so well. So there's a sustainability angle there, but also, Arielle just mentioned food sovereignty and supply chain security, and those are things that fermenting in localized spots. And if you start with some simple feedstock that might be sugars of some sort, or some kind of vegetable, or even a byproduct of some other industrial process, suddenly if you can make a protein source out of that, or some delicious set of flavor compounds that might otherwise only come from halfway across the world, then suddenly you've found this very powerful way to actually address some of the most important food supply and food sovereignty issues that the world, whatever part of the world you're in today, that we face.
And do you think that this could be achievable in a big scale?
Yeah, and I mean, we're already again going back to the things that Sandor said at the top. We make beer on very large scale. We make bread on huge scale. Although actually, lots of the modern bread isn't truly fermented, but we ferment already in all parts of the world on vast scales. So to do that, with some of these new techniques, whether we're sort of taking familiar organisms and techniques but applying them to different ingredients, or in some cases, and I think we'll probably talk about this a bit later, taking new organisms, or maybe organisms that have had their genetics modified to spit out some useful molecule. That scale-up process, for sure, it's possible. It can be difficult and expensive and challenging, but I believe we'll be doing all sorts of really cool, interesting, delicious fermentation at scale, very, very imminently.
That future that you project sounds delicious. And you were talking about philosophical questions. What more philosophical questions are you imagining to answer from fermentation? I find it exciting to hear you imagine.
Well, I would just point out that the past was very delicious too, and hopefully the future will be as delicious. With things like climate change, we risk, losing some species of plants and stuff that we've eaten for a long time, or the flavor. In modern ways of agriculture, we've lost flavor. I live in Britain. If you buy a tomato from the supermarket, it tastes, awful. And I know my grandparents ate better tasting tomatoes than I have access to from an average supermarket shelf. that's nothing to do with fermentation, but hopefully I would like to see fermentation as a force for solidifying the deliciousness of the future, and making sure that we don't lose some of these wonderful flavors that we've had for many, many hundreds or thousands of years even. But yeah, if you look at very quickly, fermentation can be applied to food, but also apply to things like making useful drugs that can save people's lives, and we've been doing that for 100 or so years now. But also bioremediation, so breaking down oil spillages or toxic waste. We can use microorganisms to do that, because they've been on this planet for like several billion years, and although we think of them as being weird, these extremophiles have found habitats where they can happily munch on some uranium or munch on some oil, and that for them is their form of deliciousness. So we will find ways to mobilize these microorganisms to do all sorts of useful things for us, food being one of them.
It sounds amazing. Sandor, you've taught people over the world to ferment with just a jar, some salt, and time. But now fermentation is also highly funded in labs. It's run by scientists and even algorithms. How do you feel about this shift? Is it a sign of success, or are we leaving something essential behind?
Well, I mean, I would really just only point out that I mean, fermentation has been practiced on a vast scale over the last century. Anytime we add fuel to our cars, it has ethanol that's produced in huge fermentation factories. But, we go to the liquor store. Most of what we buy there is made at a huge scale. So, I mean, I just don't think it's new, and I think that Arielle was talking a little bit about the intrinsic variability of spontaneous fermentation. And I think in that inevitable variability, we can find like the most extraordinary flavors. So, I mean, I think that the best bread you will ever eat is made at a modest scale. The best cheese that you will ever eat is made at a relatively modest scale using wild fermentation. The best of everything that you could eat is, I think, made with spontaneous fermentation. But the challenge with spontaneous fermentation is everyone won't be the best because there is this variability. So, I mean, I do not think that, industrial fermentation will ever, I hope, completely displace small scale fermentation, whether that's in, individual homes or at a, sort of small commercial scale. But there's nothing new about large scale fermentation. It's been going on. There's a lot of like really mediocre large scale fermented food that's out there. I wish for everybody that it would get better, but I certainly hope that it does not completely displace people's curiosity, people's routines and annual rituals that they practice with fermentation, the curiosity of new discovery of fermentation. And, not that people are discovering something new, but they're discovering something for themselves. And they're engaging with this process that is such a teacher. I mean, I don't see the two in conflict at all. I mean, I think that, large scale fermentation, can become more and more sophisticated, smarter, produce better products. And even then, it will not completely displace smaller scale applications of the process.
It doesn't compromise the essence of fermentation, in your opinion.
I don't think so. I mean, I would go so far as to say that, worldwide, if you take all fermentation, ethanol, alcohol production, bread production, cheese production, fermentation certainly collectively constitutes one of the largest industries in the world, has and will continue to.
Johnny and Arielle, what do you think about the way maybe this large fermentation scale can bring also positive transformations or impacts
Well, I
into
think,
this field?
like it's so I guess easy and commonplace to like frame this as kind of a dichotomy, like many things about food and values, that like lots of people don't even think to realize that like it's actually a continuum with a huge amount of territory between like single strain bioethanol and like uh uh happening in a thatched hut. And I think that for me that territory is like where most of the exciting things for me are happening. So yeah, I mean, I with very large scale things, I mean, I don't really work in that area that much, so I don't have as many insights. For me, it definitely the more like research that gets put out there, the more information there is that we can find on Google Scholar and apply in an interesting way. That's the big upside for me.
Johnny, fermentation is all about complexity. It is a technique, something that we can practice, improve, control, and precise. But at the same time, it's a field of uncertainty. Can science tame a wild craft?
I mean, that's definitely the paradox that it's inherently wild, and we have this love of control and trying to control things. I think all humans do in all sorts of fields. Um, I don't think that shouldn't be the purpose to try to tame it. I think certainly a lot of my work and research, although I'm often working in a kind of scientific context, it's about going into the field and literally going into a field sometimes and swabbing things and trying to explore these these wild ecosystems of microbes. But I don't think the purpose should be of any science really should be to try and just tame nature. Of course, if you're trying to, and this is where there's a kind of parallel with fine dining and that upper level of um, of food where consistency is key. If you want to win prizes and stars, etc., you have to produce essentially the same experience over and over again. And there's parallel there with science and scale up in industry where you want to produce the same thing so that a bottle of whiskey made this year is the same as the one in 10 years. um, so there's obviously like reasons why when we're thinking about fermenting at scale, or for certain purposes we might want to try and tame these things. But um, again, it's normally about finding a way to work within the limits and sort of desires, if you want to call it that, of a particular microbial strain or community of them. It's very difficult to force these things to do exactly what we want. And even when you get towards the point of going into yeast cells and editing genes, um, it's incredible and precise science, but still they kind of do what they want. They work or they don't work, whether you think you've got it right. And there's a huge degree of trial and error, and that's why you have these high throughput machines and computer systems to try and predict what might work or what might not work. But it's always this kind of interplay between us and the microbes, and finding a way to collaborate and produce something of interest that we want.
Diego, if we go to the kitchen, the unexpected, it's an amazing field for creativity. What what do you find in this unexpected world that fermentation opens to chefs?
I mean, definitely one key thing is, of course, flavor. Also, one thing of the fine dining, of course, like saying to try to find something new, like say like this new and interesting to showcase in a restaurant that people can go and try something that had never been tried before. But also, I was saying like this is also like this kind of paradox, no? Because you kind of trying to tame something wild, as you were saying before. Uh, but and also in a restaurant, you need some kind of a repetition. No, so if you're saying if you're doing a dish, you need to do the dish needs to be more or less the same every day for the 50 covers that you make every day, and that is like a lot of work. It's not easy every time, and that's also why in the sense like people is doing a more and more having like a small laboratory or a proper type of fermentation scale, or even like laminar flow benches to do. I mean, there's a few restaurants that have these. So in order like to really trying to, let's say, domesticate it and make this replicable, like every day you can do the same. But so this kind of paradox, but definitely what you try to look into this is definitely flavor and something like new to put into the table, no? Like to push push a little bit of what you can eat or what you cannot eat. That's like a very uh, complex, let's say, complex concept when you talk about fermentation, no? Like what is
But I mean,
legal
the
and not
fact of
legal.
not knowing where will you get to, just by so many restaurants just start by trying and see what happens when you use some enzymes or
Yes.
microorganisms, and then you discover something that you didn't even expect.
No, I mean, yes, that's the beauty of this. Like there's so millions and millions of microorganisms that we are not aware of that even exist, or we are not using the kitchen, and every time it's getting a little bit more, let's say, common, like through research. And as I also say, Ariel mentioned that, of course, like with the publication of papers and chefs trying to already know how to read papers and understanding this to start using new microorganisms that would be before they were like unknown for everyone. So I definitely think like this, try to find new microorganisms to work in the kitchen, like as a new techniques. I think it's very valuable, and it will be more and more common every time.
I mean, I think an interesting example I've used, excuse me, in recent years, is Omega Yeast, a yeast company. I think it's here in the U.S. Um, got very interested in like Norwegian kveik farmhouse yeasts and
Mhm.
similar Lithuanian ones, which, if you've never tasted them, sounds like it would be like, oh, okay, so just like very beery beer. But they have like kind of insane tropical fruit flavors. And these things were these strains were like not created in a lab. They were selected over generations and generations, in Norwegian farmhouses, and
Yeah.
stored by soaking ropes in the lees of the fermented beer. And so by like a little bit of like characterization and culturing and isolation, there's now like this huge greatly expanded palette of yeasts to be like fermenting beer and other alcoholic beverages with. And uh yeah, so the kind of interplay between accepting unpredictability and kind of hand knowledge in addition to technical, I think
What
that's one
What I
example.
really like about that example is it's sort of like it's not novel. It's not
Yeah,
something that's sort of new and
Yeah.
invented. And I think that, one of the realities of industrial fermentation, we could say, but even more broadly, 20th century fermentation was basically diminishing biodiversity. So if, traditional alcohol making and traditional bread making have always involved a diversity of yeasts, like the microbiological process of isolating a single strain, reproducing it, making that commercially available, has really diminished the diversity of fermentation in a huge way that I don't think we fully understand. And things
yeah,
like, the yogurt in the supermarket is dumbed down, microbiologically speaking, from
Mhm.
traditional kinds of yogurts, because to the early microbiologists, biodiversity was scary. And now we recognize that biodiversity has all of these benefits, including creating flavor complexity. But in the early years of microbiology, it was seen as a threat. So I think that, basically trying to use the diversity of organisms that people have used. I mean, a great example is koji. People today might define koji as Aspergillus oryzae and Aspergillus soyae, and that is koji. But that's koji because in Japan there was a very early embrace of microbiology and an isolation of strains. If you go to Korea and you look at the meiju that people are making, which is sometimes seen as an analog to Japanese koji, you'll see that there's incredible biodiversity. There's all different kinds of colors of molds that are growing. And, for some people that might be scary, but for other people, that's the source of incredible flavor complexity. So, I mean, I do think that there's tons of room for innovation. And I have no doubt that some of that innovation will be in laboratories, but some of that innovation can be people rediscovering and making use of, organisms that have been part of the biodiversity of traditional fermentation in different parts of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like Japanese fermentation, there's been probably, in the last like 20, 30 years, the most material available, at least in English. But that really belies, like the just like orders of magnitude more that's going on in places and has been going on forever in places like China and Korea and Southeast Asia, definitely.
I want to take this conversation into the way fermentation is entering the academia. But before we do that, because I think it's a nice topic to wrap up the debate, I would like to hear from you. If you could take a look into the future, let's say 5 years into the future, what would be one opportunity and one risk that each of you see in the world of fermentation, trying to answer this question like in 90 seconds top?
Sorry, I mean, I guess the opportunity is like there's so many millions of possibilities of microorganisms that we can never even start using or haven't in a way domesticated with all the million substrates that we can use. So really like the opportunities are endless. And the risk, I guess, is of course people making bad use of it, like having not the proper facilities or not the right hygiene techniques to actually make this. I will not say in a safe way, but in a proper way. I guess it's like in anything in the kitchen, no?
So you see a sanitary risk in restaurants where this might be explored
I
without the
Yes,
proper method.
I will say yes. Yeah, yeah,
Okay, Ariel, how about you?
Well, I mean, I think you know, when we think about an industrialized food system, often we think about it as consumers, so just like the end product. But I think centralization of like equipment and techniques and distribution has had all kinds of knock-on effects of needing like the feedstock, the raw ingredients to be increasingly standardized so that they can be fed into this like even more standardized system. And I think it's easy, and it has been sort of like the dogma of the 20th century that like, well, that's what science and engineering is making things like that. And I think, kind of in parallel to projects like the bread lab at Washington State University, what like Michael Mazurek and others are doing at Cornell, like breeding plants, the food plants, wheat, squashes, etc., like deliberately for flavor, not just for, hyper-specific performance in the field. The more that we understand, in a complex way, how fermentations work, not just single strain ones, the more that we can kind of, my ideal as kind of like wrest food production from this kind of chokehold that this idea that like snowballing standardization has had. So the more about how to function in a more complicated system, the more you can have a more biodiverse, regional, localized, decentralized food system. I think the flip side to that is the very same tools that make that possible also make things like when I was working at MIT, a big corporate research sponsor came by and was like, so what we want to do is to use this tech that you guys are working on to make it so that we grow only one type of orange on the entire eastern seaboard. And I was like, well, that sounds fucking horrible. But it's a tool, and depending on who is able to wield it and who it's accessible to, it can shake things up or make things more the way they are.
Even achieve like go in the opposite direction that you guys like promote, right?
Yeah.
How about you, Sander? An opportunity and a risk that you can
Well, I
point
mean,
to
I
us.
guess, an opportunity, something I'm seeing a lot of is, people using, fermentation to deal with large-scale byproducts or waste. And I think that fermentation has always been driven by abundance, seasonal abundance, different kinds of abundance. But in our time, one of the greatest sources of abundance are things that are either industrial byproducts or food that is otherwise going to waste. And I think that we're seeing some of it, and I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of the sort of potential to use fermentation to sort of reuse those food resources to turn them back into products that people will be able to enjoy. And then in terms of a risk, I mean, I think that the biggest risk is, people's palates. One of our human superpowers is that, we really can sustain ourselves on an incredible, range of things. And yet, we get very set in our patterns and in, what kinds of flavors, what kinds of textures are acceptable. And I think whenever anyone is launching a new product, whether it's, me just playing around in my kitchen and seeing if my friends will enjoy eating something that I made, or whether it's, a huge multinational corporation investing in a potential novel food product, it's just a question of like, what will people be willing to eat? What are the edges of acceptability? And fermentation certainly exists in this sort of edge of acceptability in many cases. But I mean, I think that that's always the risk when we're applying these things in in novel ways, or maybe novel ways for our region.
Johnny, how about you?
I'll try not to repeat what other people have said, but I agree with all of the above. I think that
Isn't this supposed to be a debate? Sorry.
Find a new one.
That embracing biodiversity within fermentation systems, so moving away from like single strain this and that, but also more broadly, embracing and accepting that, biodiversity is important in how, how we grow all of our food and other things, and that these communities of microbes, whether they're like the ones we know from fermentation or not, are really important to, healthy soils and food, and helping us to move away from monocultures. And also maybe just, fermentation is this amazing tool to get people to reconnect with like touching vegetables and like making their own food and cooking, which is something that we're in lots of parts of the world, not all, but we're, really losing. And so I think it could be this great, powerful tool to just reconnect people with making more of their own food, which I think is something we all need to try to encourage people to do.
Is there a risk that you see?
The risk, also just like more like bad products. Basically, like there are so many awful kombuchas that you can buy off a shelf, and to the average person, they might not, the marketing cue, touch points and cues are all the same, and so just distinguishing between these sort of terrible ones and the good ones, and whether it's a bit boring, but does there need to be kind of more legislation around like what is a kombucha? Do we define what sourdough bread is? Can you make it and sell it in a supermarket if it hasn't undergone certain processes or certain times? I don't know, but protecting those producers who are really putting in lots of time and effort and really doing something special, creating something delicious, rather than something that is basically semi-mass produced but masquerading as artisanal.
Yeah. Cipriano, I want to bring to the conversation the way fermentation is also finding its way in the academy, not because it's something new, but maybe because in the gastronomy world, it's interesting to find so many people trying to connect a master with fermentation, or many people studying doctorado, no, in this, also in this field. Like Basque Culinary Center can also tell the story in an interesting way. What can you share with us about it?
We were at a time when fermentation is no longer a niche practice or a culinary curiosity. It has become a language for reimagining food, rethink system, and generate culture. In this bubble intersection of science, tradition, and transformation, we see fermentation just rising in restaurants, research labs, food kitchens, and even startups. So all this energy with channeled into a very special academic journey, the master in the food fermentation, that because we believe fermentation is not just something we do, it's something we do with, and we have been talking about all this time. It's a collaboration between microorganisms, raw materials, and human intention. And when we mix all these forces, something come up new and delicious. And it's not just food, not just knowledge, it's culture, it's connection. So fermentation is one practice that belongs equally to the kitchen, to the labs, to the field, to home, and it's a cultural heritage, scientific phenomena, and a culinary technique woven together. So I will have it talking about it is alive, literally, it's alive. And that is what is making so powerful. So because of that, in Basque Culinary Center, we create this first master, it's a venture. This master degree about food fermentation within the field of the gastronomy side. So we have three pillars: the scientific technical, the culinary, and the social side. So we try to train our students not only to ferment, but to think within the fermentation, scientific, creatively, and cultural. So the curriculum is a multidisciplinary as fermentation itself. We are going to study from microbiology to entomology to anthropology and sensory analysis, instrumental analysis. And this is just knowledge, it's a transformation in action. So fermentation is a living process. So students are going to move between theory and practice, between the classroom to the kitchen to the lab, and having a real world application. So we bridge these worlds of the science and applied gastronomy, and the students will prototype, formulate, and test all the ideas that they are going to came out within this time. So we are, as a fermentation become more visible, more strategic, more essential. From Basque Culinary Center, for us is very important, the education must rise to meet this moment. So this program is our contribution to this future that we were talking about right now, creating a living platform where fermentation is studied, practiced, and reimagined. So you feel, guys, the call to explore this world and to explore it more deeply, you are welcome to join us. And thank you for being part for this amazing webinar that we are having here.
And we are about to finish this conversation. I would like only to listen to you share an idea of why is it important to collaborate? Why should chefs and scientists work together in fermentation?
Because fermentation, having only studied just very focused in one field, the precision fermentation, and the gastronomy science is a new discipline. It's a new discipline that is mixing different worlds. So when we see through the lens of this multidisciplinary, we realize that the thought that we were having was too small. And we arrive to conclusion as any organism they can ferment or being fermented under the vision of the gastronomy science just had to be eatable. So the future of fermentation, in my opinion, is why we don't know nothing.
How about Johnny, Sander, and Arielle? What do you need a chef like Diego?
Well, I mean, personally, there's almost nothing I enjoy more than working on a topic with someone who's well informed in a completely different approach than mine. And I think like it would be the height of arrogance for a scientist to suggest that they're like an expert in every possible approach to their topic. And frankly, I think some of the most interesting questions I've had to work on come out of the kind of mindset and thinking and things that chefs notice. So it's kind of a no-brainer for me.
I think I agree. It's where the magic happens. And if we go down to the microbial level, there's so much. I mean, there's obviously competition, but there's lots of collaboration in most of our favorite ferments as well. And I think we could take a leaf out of the microbes book and engage in collaboration as well.
Nice.
What's your opinion on this, Sander?
Well, I mean, I just think that, I mean, everything about fermentation is a collaboration. The reason fermentation is inevitable and practiced everywhere is the fact of biodiversity and the fact that all of our plants and all of our animal products that make up our food are populated by these microorganisms. Humans developed all of these techniques, but, I mean, scientists, researchers are just illuminating what people have been doing all along and helping us to recognize more nuanced ways in which we can apply these processes. And of course, chefs who are just devoted to culinary creativity, just think of applying it in new ways. So I think of like, a one-time student of mine who went on to write this amazing book, Koji Alchemy, Jeremy Umansky. He's a chef. And, I mean, it's really one of the most gratifying things in the world to see someone who was a student of yours just take the ideas you introduced them to totally new heights that you never would have thought of. And to me, working with chefs is like that. So they you take a relatively straightforward ancient process, and someone whose just brain is going off with like creative ideas for creating flavor, combining flavors, layering flavors, can really just go crazy with it. So, I mean, I think that, the collaborations between culinary professionals, scientists, really enhance fermentation for everybody. Even though I will continue saying over and over again, you don't need to be a scientist and you don't need to be a trained chef to work with fermentation or to be creative with fermentation.
So true.
You need to dare and try.
Yeah.
Well,
I have something here that I just want to show you. This is something that
Please.
I was gifted by a student of mine who's actually in Spain, another Diego who lives in Spain, who does not teach at the Basque Culinary Center. But this is basically a brine from cauliflower, turmeric, and ginger fermented, but dried into just crystals, just little, dried into basically salts. So a salt enhanced brine, dehydrated, that's now a finishing salt. So, fermentation knows no bounds other than our imaginations. And I think that, training can really enhance, what we imagine is possible. So, that's why I'm excited about, sort of seeing fermentation recognized, both as a science and as a culinary art. It's not that everybody has to study them, but the people who are studying them and illuminating them, really expand the possibilities for all of us.
I would add that we also need chefs like Diego to make these kind of webinars take place. So thank you, Diego. Thank you, Cipriano, Johnny, Sandor, and Arielle. It was a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks so much.
Till next time.
Thank you.
See you
And
soon.
thank you to all the
Bye.
people who came and were listening and watching.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.